My name is Uy Win Wen, and I'm a senior sociology and anthropology major. I am pleased to introduce our convocation speaker on this very snowy day. Kao Kalia Yang from the class of 2003 is a Hmong-American writer, filmmaker, and teacher. She is also a co-founder of Words Wanted, a company that is dedicated to helping immigrants with writing, translating, and business services. Yang was born in the refugee camps of Thailand to a family that escaped the genocide of the secret war in Laos. She came to St. Paul, Minnesota at the age of 6, and her first book, The Latehomecomer, a Hmong Family Memoir, reflects upon this move. It is the first Hmong-authored book to gain national distribution from a literary press. Her memoir, The Song Poet, a Memoir of My Father, is the first Hmong story to be adapted into an opera by the Minnesota Opera. Yang's other work includes her children's books, A Map into the World, and The Shared Room, as well as a groundbreaking collection titled What God is Honored Here, writings on miscarriage and infant loss by and for Native women and women of color. She has also written a collective memoir about refugee lives with the title of Somewhere in the Unknown World. Her work, which has been recognized by several prestigious awards, is passionate, eloquent, and deeply rooted in her and her family's experiences as she seeks to further the understanding of the human condition in order to garner more compassion in the world. The title of her presentation today is When Our Stories Come Together. Please join me in welcoming Kao Kalia Yang back to Carleton College.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me well? I can hear myself very well. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be back, to see the faces of beloved friends, and to meet some of the new students. I feel in many ways like I never left Carleton. I came in 2003, graduated, have been back here as visiting faculty, and then I'm in and out continually of your classrooms. And so in many ways, this feels very much like coming home. For those of you who don't know me and my background, I started writing my first book here as a senior. My grandmother, a Hmong-American woman who never learned how to read or write. Her big thing was every time they dropped me off here, she'd say, Menai, one day when you graduate, I will leave this car behind. You can hold my hand. You can show me your wonderful bald spot. You can take me in and out of those buildings. Winter break, my grandma took a fall. I went to her and I said to her, Grandma, get up. She said to me, I can't. You have to understand that there were people who loved me before you. Before you, I had a mom and a dad, brothers and sisters. And while there is no Hmong land in a bigger world, I'm going to climb this Hmong mountain in my heart. Swing open the door to the house of my youth. Everybody will be there. Dinner will be ready. Your grandfather, my most precious baby girl. My mother, my father, all of them. I cried for her to stay, but my grandma could not. Her time had come. And so she never did make it out of that car onto Carleton's campus with me. But in the days after her passing, as I was fumbling my way through comps, I started what would become my very first book, The Latehomecomer, a Hmong Family Memoir. Grandma's big fear was that she would be forgotten because she didn't know how to read or write, because all of my life with her, she signed her name with a shaky X that stood in for Jolie. And so I went on this journey, this love letter, page 38, because I had a lot to say. And my dad said to me, what are you doing? And I said to him, I'm writing a love letter to my grandma. And my father said, words that changed the course of my life. If you dream in the right direction, the dream never dies, the dreamer never wakes. It gets stronger and stronger, Menai. Because of him, I'm a writer today. Because of her, the stories, they're older than I am. Because of my children, they have to live longer than I do. But I'm super happy to be back to share from my newest work, Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir. From the moment the Latehomecomer came out, when I started doing public talks, everywhere I went, there was some refugee waiting, asking, would you ever be interested in writing my story too? Because I was so young, I was still learning how to carry the emotions of a family and a community. Because as a marginalized person myself, I understood the importance of representation. I said, I'll teach writing. Send your young people to me so that the stories can come from your homes. But in 2016, I could feel it. The winds of America, the winds of the world were shifting. The storms were coming. And again, it was the words and the wisdom of my grandma that guided me. Ever since I was a little girl in Ban Vinai refugee camp, this place where my people were held, where we got food 3 days out of the week only, my grandma's always said to me, you are going to build your life because of your faith, not because of your fears. It is your faith that will allow you to build your lives. She who was a shaman, a medicine woman, and a healer. And so in 2016, I sought to do what I never imagined I would do. I understood certain fundamentals. Minnesota is not high for diversity as a state, but we have more refugees per capita than any other state in the nation. When we talk about immigration and refugees, the conversation tends to center on the coast. But I believed that it should be centered here in the beating heart of America. And so I went into my community and I started talking to people, knowing 3 things. 1, I knew that if I was going to talk to somebody, I would write their stories down, no matter what they told me. I had seen so many people, scholars and journalists, enter into my community, ask my elders for their stories, watch them cry, sometimes wept with them, and then a better case study comes along or an angle shifts and nothing happens. I didn't want to do that. 2, I knew that if I talked to these people forever, I would want to write their books, which would have meant 14, 15 books instead of the 1. So I had to be disciplined. I was going to talk to them for as long as they wanted to talk to me, and then everything else would be via phone or via email. 3, I didn't want to go into my community looking for, quote, the spectacular refugee. I didn't want to look for a refugee where people would immediately feel bad for them, or feel the plight that they were in, the historical, the contemporary flight. I wanted to meet them as individuals and for my readers to meet them as such. And so what happens, though, comes out in 2020. Joe Biden has just been elected, and this book comes out. I don't believe in coincidences. Sometimes these are the forces that are necessary in bringing a work like this into the world, a writer like me into a stage like this. And so I'm going to read just excerpts from across several of these stories, because something magical happens when our stories can come together, not only within a community like this, but within the larger community, the human community. And so from somewhere in the unknown world, a collective refugee memoir, an oxymoron right on the title page. Dedication. For the refugees from everywhere, men, women, and children whose fates have been held by the interests of nations, whose rights have been contested and denied, whose thirst and hunger go unheeded and unseen. It opens with a poem by the great American poet, Lucille Clifton. Quilting. Somewhere in the unknown world, a yellow-eyed woman sits with her daughter quilting. Some otherwhere alchemists mumble over pots. Their chemistry stirs into science. Their science freezes into stone. In the unknown world, the woman, threading together her need and her needle, nods toward the smiling girl. Remember, this will keep us warm. How does this poem end? Do the daughters' quilt? Do the alchemists practice their tables? Do the worlds continue spinning away from each other forever? The best way to test the mettle of our words is to speak them to the world, and so that's what I'll do. I've chosen different selections from across the book. This is a part of Awo's story, the strongest love story. Awo's family was from Somalia. I am a little girl with an oval face emphasized by my hijab. I have big, round eyes, a small nose, a fine chin. The adults think I'm like a doll, a picture of cuteness. I like the way they see me. I am so young that I also like the way I see myself. I stand in a courtyard. The walls around me are painted white. There's a bright sun shining down. It is almost noon because the sun is on top of me and my shadow is short and squat. There is a heavy wind blowing. My hijab spreads out around me. My gray shadow is a more magical creature than human, a changing thing moving in different directions. I lift my arms. I have wings like a bird. I fly around and around the courtyard. I hug the hard, smooth skin of the palm tree in front of me. I see that there is a matching one on the other side of the yard. My little girl arms wrap themselves around the thick trunk. The tree feels alive, warm, fleshy, but too firm to be flesh. My hold is tight around the tree. My fingers meeting on the other side. I am clinging. I realize that I'm afraid. My feelings are suddenly confused. I notice that there are 2 guard dogs running around the compound. They have their yellow eyes on me. Their bodies are black. Their nails are sharp. They walk toward me. Their tails raise high. Their ears are pointy triangles in the air. Their mouths are open, teeth glistening white. They're snarling at me. I can hear the wind from their throats. I look around and I try to find safety. All the adults are gathered in a corner of the compound. They stand, with their heads bowed beneath the shade of a tree, its mushroom canopy casting a shadow over them. I can see an aunt standing in the edge of the group. Her hands are held to her face. She's crying. Grief is pouring out of her body like a bucket tipped over. I can make out her cries, louder than the dogs. She is my target for protection. I run for her. The dogs run for me. We chase each other around and around in a figure 8. They run like circus dogs, trained to follow each other, so it looks like a child's game. To the adults, the grown-ups cannot tell how afraid I am. They're not even looking at me. When I run out of breath, I feel my feet slipping. I know I will crash to the ground. I can feel the pounding of my blood coursing through my veins. I can see the splatter of red on the ground. Once the fangs of the hungry dogs penetrate my skin, I make a noise, part squeak and part scream. My aunt's arms are around me. She lifts me high. The dogs back slowly away. My arms are tight around my aunt's neck. I make sure the dogs are no longer a danger before I look at her face. Her brown skin is wet with streams of tears. My fingers, small and slender, move to stem the flow of wet on her face. Her skin is smooth. I let my hand skim along the surface of her wet face, follow the wet streaks from her eyes all the way down to her chin, until I touch her scarf. Her scarf is damp. I look around me as if waking from a dream. All the adults around me are crying, eyes trained to the base of the tree. All of a sudden, I hear their sniffles, wails, hiccups, blowing noses, swallowed cries. I shift around in the arms holding me. I can feel the stiffness of her hold, then hesitance, and then give. I see the rectangle of dug earth in the ground, the pile of red and yellow dirt of Mogadishu by its side. I see the open coffin, the rigid body of my uncle inside, his eyes closed to the brightness of the day, his face as gray as the remnants of last night's fire in the dawn. Again from Awo's story. I'm walking through fog. They're arguing, my mother and father. They don't do this often. This is not a normal occurrence in my life. She is telling him we have to leave for America, for our education, for the future. She is telling him that no price is too high to pay for our eventual success. He wants her to stay. He wants his children close. He is comfortable driving the distance, when possible, from Boonhoodle to Lascanood. There is a future in Somalia. They have parents. Their parents have land and animals. The children can grow up and become good adults like us, still. Their education have not been interrupted. They will be fine. She will not hear any of it. Her voice is steel. It can cut. It will cut. It will make such a clean cut through my father's heart that he will not be able to feel it until we are gone. I'm staring at a wall. I see my mother and my father on this day as characters in a mural. She is wearing black and he is wearing white. There is no setting, no sun, no moon, no other characters. Just the two of them on the white wall of my childhood. He is smaller, he is in the background, she looms large. She's beautiful and wise, and she stands so tall and elegantly, her head high, facing the blank future, unafraid. She tells him, I will come back one day. We will buy land enough to build 5 houses. The children will live in those houses. We will be together again in Boonhoodle. He tells her, I'm a man, I'm a husband, I'm a father. If you go away, if you take the children, what is left of me? She says, you are a doctor as you were when I met you. Your first duty is to take care of those in front of you. I'm a nurse. My duty is to assist your work to the best of my ability. His exhausted sigh, his defeated sigh. My father, just a man in white, his hands parted, palms open, a gesture always of welcome, of goodwill. He is a warrior fighting the good fight, not with a sword, but with his steadfast obedience to my mother's vision of the world. The fog grows thick and it grows thin as I grow up and I grow older. Awol's family meets every Saturday on the phone. That is when they get to be a family. This has been the case for the last 20 years. This is Myra's story. Myra is from Bosnia. Myra is 6 feet tall. I'm barely 5. The day I met Myra, we both had on the exact same shirt. And I thought, looks better on her. But then we started talking, and I saw all the overlaps of our story. Myra works for the IRC, the International Refugee Committee. And Myra's mom and dad wonder why she chooses to return to all of these sites of war, where she could live here and know peace. In some ways, my mother wishes I would write fairy tales of the incredible dragons that simmer and breathe beneath the water, the boiling river, the great Mississippi. She wishes I could build castles with my words, and yet I journey back to places that have taught her despair and sorrow, hope and courage too, but loss, this landscape of grief that is so much the life of the refugee. Myra's story, a little piece from it. Sometimes we play a game. Do you remember? Myra, what do you do when the sirens go off? Get the key from the hook, lock the door, go down to the basement. Wait there until the sirens go off. Stay there until the neighbors leave the basement. Follow them. Return to the apartment. Unlock the door. Put the key back on the hook. Sit, color, or draw until you come home. Mama, what do you do when you come home? Race up the stairs and call out, Myra, 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 on the landing. We laugh when we play the game, but we never laughed when Mama came home in real life. She was always out of breath. I was always out of breath. Our hearts pounded in our chest, in each other's arms. Myra, do you remember Papa? On the day Papa joined the army, the sun was warm and bright in Zenica. Papa came home in his usual fashion. Once the greetings were done, he moved to a chair in front of the television. His long musician's hands clasped and unclasped beneath his chin. He looked into the dark screen of the television, studying his reflection. Mama was in the kitchen. I was at the table with my coloring book. In a careful voice, Papa called Mama and me to him. Mama picked me up at the dining table and held me in her lap on a chair by Papa's. Papa cleared his throat before he said, "I have news. Today, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina came to my workplace to do a draft. I was not drafted, but our dear friend was. As you know, he is Catholic. As you know, the Army is entirely Muslim. As you know, he would not survive the war in the Army as a Catholic man." I turned up my head toward Mama. Her eyes were on Papa's face. She studied him, her brow furrowed. "What?" she said. Papa cleared his throat. His large hands now capped his knees. He leaned toward Mama and me and said, "I could not live with myself if I let my best friend die. I have volunteered to go in his place." Mama's body became stiff where moments before it had been soft. She said, "You volunteered to join the Army in order to save your dear friend?" Papa nodded. She repeated her words, "You volunteered to join the Army in order to save your dear friend?" Mama shook her head, but she said, "Okay." Myra, from the age of 4 until she was 8, lived in this dark apartment. Her mother had to leave for work every single day, despite the fact that there was nothing to do at work. That was how she could get the rations. In that time, Myra's mom had miscarriages, just like my mother. In that time, her mother would hide gifts around the apartment and pretend that they were from her father, so that she would remember him. Myra, who ends up going to the college I almost went to if I hadn't come to Carleton, Macalester College. So this is from Myra's story. I know exactly what I wanted to study: international studies and economics. I wanted to rebuild what the wars had broken. Richard Holbrook was our freshman convocation speaker. He was the man who had drafted the peace agreement that ended the Bosnian War. As he was talking, I felt the goosebumps rise on my arms, not because of the content of his words, but for the fact that life had brought me to this moment in time. In my junior year of college, for a moment, I questioned what I wanted to do and who I would become. Then I discovered that I had been placed in Kirk Hall in Kofi Annan's old room. Kofi Annan was then the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. I reckoned with myself. There was always only one thing I would ever become: this child refugee, a person who knew and understood what it was like to grow up in a war. I had to become brave, and I had to use whatever means I could find to save the pieces of myself that were in danger of dying in that lonely apartment where I waited for peace. Like Myra, when I was at Carleton in my senior year, there was a fellowship. One day I got a flyer in my mailbox right here at Carleton, and it said it was the New American Fellowship, from the Soros Foundation. And I took that flyer and I stuck it. I got it as a sophomore. I stuck it in a book. And in my senior year, I came across that flyer again, and I applied as a Soros Fellow. This is after my grandma died, when I had already decided I wanted to pursue writing. I applied knowing that Henry Kissinger was big in this foundation, that he was on the board of directors. And I know what role Henry Kissinger had played in Vietnam, in the secret war in Laos, that had decimated my people, that had sent the winds of war after us. But I applied anyway, saying that I wanted to be a writer because life had taken me here, and that I wanted to be a writer to come from these stories that had been undocumented, to enter into a curriculum that had never had room for people like me before. And so, like Myra, my own journey has taken me to lots of places, among them New York City. This is a really short story, but I know that there are Korean students here at Carleton, or I'm going to read a short excerpt of it. It's an incredible human being named Kao, who looked me in the eye and said, "Tell the world what happened, tell the world what I did." Let the world judge me, for I have already judged myself. So Kao is Karen. Our kids go to the same school. In my union with a woman who decided to dedicate her life to me, we had 3 children together. 3 stateless children, citizens of no country, recognized by no nation. My beautiful baby boys are born with dark hair, skin the color of the earth. Their maternal grandfather, an old man who, like his daughter, belonged to the world as we knew it, not some imaginary place of freedom, gave my sons the gift of poetry. Karen names calling on their worth. Lala Kao was the first. His name meant that he was worthy of a country. Lala Hok Kao was the second. His name meant that he was worthy of the earth. Lala Mu was the third. His name meant he was worthy of the universe. I lived like a sun, and they revolved around me like planets, the women and the children of the stratosphere. Again, from Kao's story. Kao, who, as the world would have it, was also funded by the Soros Foundation, and so ended up in Bangkok, Thailand, getting a university degree, leaving this woman and these 3 boys behind. I met an American woman named Jill. She worked on a team sent to interview refugees for resettlement. Jill was tall and her skin was smooth and pale. Her eyes were large and brown and smart, unclouded by cynicism, unfazed by hardship. They were empathetic and kind. They were so unlike my own. Beyond these things, Jill was well-fed, well-educated, and well-loved. She was comfortable in the world, like a rock at the bottom of the river, feeling the movement from above, but steady and strong where she was positioned. Most intriguing, she was interested in me, and I found her refreshingly interesting in return. Jill was drawn to me as I was drawn to her, perhaps because I was everything she was not. We became friends, knowing we could be something more. Jill left Thailand after her professional responsibilities were through. We'd only known each other for 2 months' time. Over email and on the phone, through the spread of 4 years, Jill and I talked of our days. For the first time in my life, I could laugh with someone about the hard things because the threat of them felt far away. Somehow, with Jill, in the world, it wasn't a struggle anymore. Each day, our bond grew stronger and stronger. I was not surprised when the time came and Jill asked, her voice soft and her words low, weighted by all the reasons why ours was a risky match, if she could petition for me to come to America on a fiancé visa. I was scared. Jill knew about my children and the woman waiting for me. Jill knew that there had been no formal marriage between us. Jill knew about my longing for security and my rebellious heart, and she still wanted to be with me. This time, I would not be leaving behind a bad situation, which was my justification for everything I had done. This time, I will be leaving good circumstances for a reality where I would have to start anew in the arms of one person who would have more power over me than anyone ever had before. I hesitated. But the thing about life is this: when we are unsure, the universe isn't. This one I will save as the final one. But I wanted to read Mr. Michael's story. Mr. Michael's daughters had also gone to Carleton. Helen and I met right here, and when I said on social media that I was going to do this book project, Helen reached out to me and said, "My father's an incredible storyteller." And so I met Mr. Michael, and this is a part of the story that he told me, officially unconfirmed is what the piece is called. Mr. Michael says that there are pictures that his heart has taken that has never been developed for a bigger world. And his hope when I write his story is that I develop some of these images. This is one of them. In the refugee camp at the height of the crisis, there were 25,000 people sick with cholera. This was in Sudan. The disease did not discriminate among the poor and war-stricken population. On the hospital beds, men and women and children lay head to foot, side by side, writhing in agony, or so quiet and still they were depleted and appeared dead. The people were like tubes. What we put in one end flow out of the other. In the camp hospital, doctors and nurses and all medical personnel were called to attention. We ran down the aisles doing our best to respond to the cries and the pleas of the sick and those who loved them. The stench of vomit and diarrhea, of human sweat and fear filled the rooms, and the flies flew in swarms of black above them. The sick people sat, if they could, hands holding their tummies, their heads. Those who could not sit slept on the beds, skin and bones disappearing beneath the clothes they wore. Their eyes were closed. Their eyes were open, holes in the skeletal faces. They stared without seeing. Sounds of human suffering abounded, day and night, with the endless buzzing of the flies. In those 2 years, all of time became the suffocating moment, the frenzy, the crazy, the impossible task of helping the sick ones make it through the painful process, one way or another. Near the end of the epidemic, the refugee camp hospital had no more gloves. We, lower-level workers, handed the doctors in charge the gloves that we could find. None of them took the gloves from our proffered hands. They shook their heads, too busy for words, and gestured for us to put them on. Sweat dribbled down their faces, dark faces glistening in the heat of battle, once pale faces now flushed red. The United Nations doctors saved the gloves for the nurses and the ambulance drivers like me. They worked without gloves around the clock through the night and the day to save the people. Only 700 people died because of them. I promised myself then that if I had money one day, I would give it to the United Nations doctors. What they did in that Sudanese refugee camp saved a part of me that was in danger of dying. I had seen how people could take lives in Asmara. In the despair of the camp in Sudan, I saw how people could give life, and somehow in this knowledge, my dreams for humanity were saved. 3 of Mr. Michael's daughters came to Carleton, by the way. This is the story that started the whole collection. It's Fong Li, who is my uncle. He said to me after the Latehomecomer, after the song Poa, he said to me, I have one story to tell you. I want you to write it down. I want you to tell it to the world. Tell it to them before I die. And this is a piece of that story that he told me. It's called Sisters on the Other Side of the River. There was a full moon the night of our crossing. All along the river, families were preparing to enter the water. I had seen 2 little girls going from family to family. In the moonlight, I could see the people shaking their heads at the girls. I prayed they would not come to us. The older one was 6 or 7 years old. Her scraggly hair fell about her face. She carried the little girl on her back with a length of cloth. The child was 3 or 4, but too weak to walk. In the older girl's arms, she carried a small pot. The little one whimpered occasionally, raising her head weakly, turning it from one side to the other, seeking comfort. Her sister was quiet as she walked along the line of families. It was impossible to ignore them. I had just blown up the raft and was tying my children together when the girls walked toward us. In the light of the moon reflected off the surface of the river, I saw her eyes, big and round in her sunken face. She offered what was in her pot to me before her words came out. She said, "This is all I have left in the world, this little bit of rice and the little sister on my back. Our mother and father, our aunts and uncles and grandparents were killed in the jungle. We are alone. We've traveled for the last 5 days on our own to get here." I said, "I can't help you, I'm sorry." She persisted. "I will give you this rice if you carry my baby sister with your family to the other side. I know it is not much rice, but it is all I have left." I said again, this time with more roughness in my voice because my children could hear her, "I'm sorry, but there's no room on the raft." The girl's thin arms shook with the proffered rice in the near empty pot. Her little sister turned her head at the roughness of my voice to look at me. Those eyes, too, were large and dark like a little monkey's. They glistened at me, wet with tears. The older girl fell to her knees. It looked as if her thin legs had given out from under her. Her head was bowed, and she begged, "Please, Uncle, you don't have to take me. I'm willing to die here on this side of the river. I would die happy knowing my sister is safe. Please, Uncle." I shook my head at her, my own words now wet and sticky in my throat. The girl turned to my wife, who had our baby girl strapped to her front, and said, "Please, Auntie, please." She started to cry. We were the last family at the river's edge. Her cries turned into sobs. My wife's arms tightened around our little baby's body. I stood in front of the girl on her knees and my shaking wife. I said, "Little girl, we have to go into the river now. The soldiers are surely coming. You take your sister and you go hide in the jungle. When other families come, you ask them. Someone will help you. We can't." Her shoulders shook with her cries. She had no more words for us. The rice in the pot was in danger of spilling. I took hold of it with my hands. I put it down beside her. I said to my boys and my wife, "Hurry up." I turned from the girls and I pushed the raft into the river. I picked up my boys one by one and dropped them onto the raft. I helped my wife and our baby daughter strapped to her front onto the raft. The flimsy thing nearly toppled. I could hear the other men hurrying their families into the current. A voice called out, "The soldiers are coming." I felt a tug on my shirt. I had hoped the girl would have walked away, taken my words to heart, and found a place to hide. I had hoped hopelessly. She stepped into the river after me. I did not have the heart to pry those fingers loose, so I said, "I'll come back for you both, I promise. As soon as I get my children and my wife to the other side, I will turn back for you. Just wait here." Her fingers fell from my shirt. My wife echoed my words to the girls, my children too. I turned to the girls one last time and I placed my hand on each of their heads, a sign of love. I looked into their eyes and I believed myself I would come back for them. The water was cold against my legs. The cold climbed higher as I walked farther into the river. My feet lost touch with the river's bottom. I treaded water. I kicked water. Somewhere at the halfway point of the crossing, floating in the Mekong River, I clung to the raft and I looked back at the girls. I could see they were still standing in the river, both staring straight ahead towards me. Their small pot of rice sat on the bank. Every few minutes, I looked back at them until they disappeared from view, until they were nothing more than lines of shadows in the moonlit night. Again, this is from Mr. Michael's story. This is from Fong Lee's story. People from the community come and they say, "You're doing well for yourself and your family. You are a good man." They don't know the truth. They don't know that nearly 40 years ago, on the banks of the Mekong River, on my way to freedom, I condemned 2 sisters to war. They don't know that I cannot forget those 2 girls, their eyes that night round like the moon in the high sky, looking at me, the lie I told, the lie I carry. They don't know that one day soon, when my time comes, I will look into those eyes again and see the knowledge that I was not the man the sisters had been waiting for, that I could not be him. I pray and I hope that in another life, beneath a different moon, I will be the man to turn that raft around. And the last reading I would do is from Afghani's story. These stories in this book, the stories in my life, are fairly urgent. They're not stories from the past. Afghani's family was outside of the Kabul airport when the bombs went off. Just a month and a half ago, Afghani's mom snuck to the market to get food. The Taliban, they stoned her. They called her the mother of an infidel. But this is just a little bit from Afghani's story. It's called Certificate of Humanity. So Afghani, a little bit of a preface. Afghani worked for USAID. Afghani graduated from university at the age of 19, brilliant young man. The US went to him and said, "Would you like to help your people?" He says, "Okay." He works with the US. A few months in, one day they're at the market, his cell phone rings and Afghani picks it up, says, "Hello." There is a man's voice on the other side speaking in Dari, saying, "Who should I kill first? Your mother is wearing white, you're wearing black. Who should I kill first?" This becomes, it's aggravated. It becomes such that Afghani starts hiding in the house. And then eventually his family, in a desperate effort to save him, come up with $25,000 US. That's the international human trafficking rate. If you want a credible trafficker to work with you, which is to say a trafficker with a contract to sign. But they find the money, and Afghani is able to leave. An incredible story of leaving, but ends up at a 5-star resort in Sweden. This incredibly resourceful resort owner decided to turn this resort into a refugee camp from people around the world. And so this is in the Alps. And Afghani keeps asking everybody for this thing called Certificate of Humanity. Everybody thinks Afghani has lost it. And so Afghani is sent to the camp psychologist. The camp psychologist got to know me well. At first, she was unsure about my mental health. She was baffled by my request for a certificate of my humanity. She asked me if I believed I was human. I said, of course, but other people weren't so sure. So I needed help proving my humanity. She then offered to provide me with such proof. But why? I asked her, what is the difference between you and me? How come you are more human than me, in a position to observe and certify my humanity? After all, do we not have the same blood, the same makeup, the same dreams even? Why are you more successful in your humanity than I am in mine? I told her that if she was going to give me a certificate of my humanity, she would have to show me hers first. I had to know who had given her the authority to determine human certification. I had been a human in my country, a human in a war. I told the psychologist that the war was a war on terrorism, but I was not a terrorist. I told her about the warlords, the communists, the religious thinkers, and the powerful humanitarians, all doing battle in my country. I told her that I was just a human being and that many of the human beings in my country hate war. We were victims of war. To be specific, of the Americans and the Russians and their allies and their battle for power over people. She listened to me and she took notes. Finally, she said, "You are not sick." She was then the first in a long time to say, "Thank you. Please come back to talk to me so that I can learn from you." I would not have returned to her office if it was only for her to learn from me. I was also learning from myself. I was in so much pain, and my pain was so focused that I was unable to learn from myself. It took her taking the notes during our meetings and then reciting them back to me for me to know that I was saying and thinking and feeling that these things were real. Afghani ends up in Minnesota, of all places, because Afghani is on Facebook and he's looking for a certificate of humanity, and a Minnesotan activist from Minneapolis says, "Who are you?" And so Afghani ends up here in St. Paul, where he drives a Lyft at night. In the office, he works at a community college as an office manager. But this is Afghani's day. In America, I work 16 to 18 hours a day. During the week, I'm an office manager at a community college. After work and on the weekends, I'm a Lyft driver. I live modestly in a small apartment. Every dollar that I do not need, I send to my family in Afghanistan. It brings me pride. Because of me, my family is middle class. They have food to eat. My baby brother can go to school. Because of me, they're not lost in Afghanistan. Someone in America sees them clearly and loves them completely. I've been in America for 3 years. I'm now 29 years old. I'm engaged to a woman my mother has chosen in Afghanistan. I've not met her, but I know that she has a master's degree in Islamic studies. Will I be able to sponsor her and marry her? I don't know. I don't know when a life will begin beyond this one, where I work hard and I take pride where I can. In this life, I've learned that Afghanizada is as much human as anyone in this country or any other. I am as human as you are. That's from Afghani's story. Just 3 weeks ago, I helped him do the humanitarian parole paperwork to try to get his family out. That is the writer before you. This is the kind of work I do. These are the stories that keep me up at night. These are the stories that keep me going during the day. I'm delighted at this opportunity to return to Carleton, my alma mater, but also a place that I've been thinking a great deal about because I have an 18-year-old brother applying to colleges, and one of them is Carleton. On his own accord, people. I didn't say anything. So Carleton's been on my mind lately. It's a beautiful opportunity to return. At this time, I want to engage with your thoughts and your comments. You can see I didn't walk up here with any notes. I came to be a part of this morning, to be a part of this convocation. No?
Thank you, Kalia. That was beautiful. Thank you very much for coming back. Thank you all for being here. We would like to entertain questions. I have a microphone, so if you'd like to raise your hand, please, we shall bring the microphone to you.
Did you all get very shy in this pandemic?
It's always the first one that's the hardest. After that, it opens it up. So unless you're like me, I'm having a hard time speaking right now.
Thank you so much. My question is about how you came to decide that writing was what you wanted to do, like where those clues came to you, and then how you've discovered ways to include your life story and social justice work in the writing that you're doing, especially since, I don't know, there's not a clear script for people to do that, really. I feel like you're a writer, you're a social activist, and so you're combining these roles in a really beautiful way. If you'd be willing to speak on that. Thank you.
I would be delighted. Thank you for your question. So like so many children of immigrants and refugees, we're taught that we need to become doctors and lawyers. You know, right up until the moment I came to Carleton, I was pre-med, even here, because I thought, you know, that's what my community needs, right? I'm the descendant of 3 shamans. The work of my family is to heal. It would be a very natural kind of journey for me to take. But there is a memory. I'm in seventh grade. Mom and Dad have overdrafted again. My mom has a horrible migraine, but she's running through the house, lifting up the cushions, trying to find dollars and cents, something to make up for the overdraft. We always overdrafted by like $5 or $6. My mom and dad were assemblers at night. And so I go to my room. I've become a selective mute at this time. I don't talk anymore in English because the world around me has taught me that they don't need the voices of people like my mom and dad. What use is this voice if nobody wants to hear it? So I don't talk. My mom watches Oprah, and she sees Oprah, and Oprah says, if you have a kid who doesn't talk, you should buy them a journal with a lock on it. So that's exactly what she did. She went to Kmart, got this tiny little teddy bear journal with a lock on it. I have this journal. I'm in 7th grade, and I write into it, "How does a writer become?" I'm pushing so hard that the page tears in my hands. I flip it over on the very last line in very tiny, tiny letters, the smallest letters I could possibly write. I write, "She keeps on writing, period." That's my first real concrete memory of wanting a life in writing. At Carleton, my grandma passed away my senior year. Her fear was that she'd be forgotten. I started writing a love letter to her, to tell her all of the things that I would never forget about her. She had a single tooth, and it was right here. I wanted to tell her I would never forget that. I wanted to tell her that I would never forget the fact that one of her earlobes was torn because she'd been chased by a tiger in the jungles of Laos as a little girl. As an orphan girl looking to find food for her siblings, she'd been chased by a tiger. I wanted to tell her all of these things. I was on page 37. I had comms to write, but I was on page 37 of this letter. And I'd gone home for the weekend, and my dad comes in. He says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing a love letter to Grandma." He looks at all of the pages, and he says to me, "Do you know that in the life of a dreamer, the dream never dies? You never wake. It grows bigger and bigger." I had an idea. What if the world can remember Zhuo Li with me? What if when I'm old, when my own memories start flying away from me, what if the world will remember her because I've written something? But I was still a victim of the semicolon and other grammatical structures. And so I applied to MFA programs, predominantly in fiction, because I didn't have the courage to stand behind my words. Columbia's program took me. I got a call right here. I was in Norris Hall, 3rd floor. We just buried my grandma. And Lucy Passes, who was my roommate and still my good friend, she says to me, "You have to check the machine, Kao." And I said, "Why? I'm so tired. I've been up for 72 hours. My grandma is dead. My heart is empty. What more matters?" And Lucy says, "No, no, no, you have to check it." So I pressed play. One of them was from Columbia University, saying that they had not only accepted me, they had offered me their biggest fellowship into writing. They offered 2 each year across the genres, that I would be one of those. The second message was from the Paul and Daisy Searles Fellowship for New Americans, that fellowship that I told you I applied for. The one where they asked me, "Where would you be if not for this war? Is it true that wars bring on good things, that you are one of those possibilities? If not for this war, would you be on the mountains of Laos carrying a baby on your back with a gardening hoe the size of your hand?" Where I had yelled before a finalist table full of kids from Harvard and Stanford studying predominantly law and medicine, I screamed because my uncle had given me one piece of advice: nobody can hear you unless you scream. And so I screamed, "If that is your feeling, then I don't want your money. I'll find a different way. I'm not going to sit here and be an example that wars can bring on good things. Who's to say that one of those who died so I could be here, that one of them would have become a better writer? Or that together, 3 of us could have envisioned a better pathway into this world? If that's how you feel, I don't want your money. I'll find a different way." To my surprise, the second message was from them. And they said, "We'll pay for your tuition no matter where you go, half of your tuition no matter where you go, and give you a $20,000 living stipend a year." I've always believed in the magic of my grandmother. That was the only permission I needed, if I needed permission at all. And so I went to Columbia to become a writer. And after Columbia, I came back here so that my very first book, the first book from a Hmong-American doing literary America, that it would emerge here from Minnesota, the biggest concentration of Hmong in the country. And it came from an independent press, one of Minnesota's fine independent presses. There is a story about who we are, where we're from. There's a story of how we become. And in that second story, I had much more options. I made more deliberate choices. So in that very first book, The Latehomecomer, if you look to the back, the reviews are not from famous writers. I didn't go to them. I went to the people who knew the Hmong story, who needed the Hmong story as desperately as I did, including a historian, Dr. Paul Hilmer, who've been focused and interested in the Hmong story for a long time. And the Senator Mimoa, the first elected official to gain national recognition, because she needed my story too. And somewhere in all of this, I was always the same person, the little girl who didn't talk. Except now, before a microphone, I speak to be heard. In the world, on the streets, nobody cares. I'm just one more short Hmong woman in the Twin Cities, usually in sweat gear. Nobody cares. I get disrespected at the bank. I get disrespected at the grocery store regularly. And I think that's what fuels the heart of the work that I do. The reason why I have cause to get up on a gray day, to drive through a snowstorm, to come here. How many times has somebody like me been right here? All 4 years when I was at Carleton, the person who came who looked most like me was Maxine Hong Kingston, and I was in awe just like everybody else. But sitting in those pews, I know that those are new ones, but the old pews, I never imagined that one day I would be back and I would take this microphone and speak into it, and speak into the world my dreams and my wish for a gentler place, a more loving space. You cannot divorce yourself from the stories that make you who you are, even as you're carving the story of who you would become. Did I answer your question? Yeah? No, I tell my students all the time, you have to call me on it. Don't just let me go. If you don't understand something, you have to call me on it. Everybody, even your professors, deserve a second chance.
Oh God. What have you found is the best way to support refugees?
What have I found is the best way to support refugees? I think it depends on where you're positioned. I would tell you ways that didn't work. When we lived in the housing projects, there'd be these churches, and they would send buses to pick up refugee kids. And when we were new refugees, we thought that we might get presents, because we had learned about Christmas, and we learned that kids get presents on Christmas. And so we started getting dressed every weekend and going to church. We wait in line, and this bus would come, and we go to church. They take us to these nice churches. I remember one particular one on the edge of a highway that was completely white, fresh paint, and they had everybody was sitting on the pews, but they had the refugee children walk up the aisle, and so all of these kids are like looking at us, and then we would have to go up there, and we didn't speak English, but everybody got a Bible, and then all the people would sing, and then they'd say sing along, but we didn't know how to sing, so we'd start mouthing, doing our best. If Mass were then, in fashion, it would have been easier. But we would mouth along. We did this for like months. And on Christmas, do you know what they gave us? They handed out notebooks and pencils. And we looked, and there were white kids on those pews with toys and actual gifts. And we were looking too much, so the preacher said to us, say thank you. The preacher said to us, that book and that pencil's gonna do a lot more for you than a toy. The next day, the next week, none of us showed up. When people would come and ring our doorbells, none of us were home. We just looked, There are ways that have been done that have not been really kind or very gentle or very thoughtful. Depending on where you're positioned, I think the best way to help refugees is honestly to be as generous and open as you can in hearing where they are and what they need. Every refugee needs a different thing, is also the truth. And that's one of the big points for me. And as I'm working on Somewhere in the Unknown World, every refugee needs something else. And sometimes it isn't our place to give it. Sometimes we can't give it. All we can offer, the only thing any of us have ever been able to offer each other, is a gentle welcome. 50, 60 years from now, that will still be your gift to give. There's no expiration date, but that is the only gift that one human being can offer another. Did I answer your question? Anyone else?
Hi, my question is from Women's Introduction. I know that you are also a filmmaker, so I'm thinking how you are using film as a medium to convey maybe social justice work or maybe other things, other aspects of you.
That's a wonderful question. So I think that I have a poet sensibility of the world, actually. I have a few bad poems published, but I'm not a poet. My dad is a poet. I'm the daughter of a song poet. That's really important for me to say. But the way I encounter the world is really visual. It's very sensory rich. That very first film that I made, The Place Where We Were Born, a lyric documentary, I started because when I was at Columbia, there was a doctor. And this doctor had been to the camp, Bambinai refugee camp, the year, the month, the week I was born. But he couldn't believe that there was a Hmong student studying at Columbia. And so he told one of my classmates this, and my classmate goes, there is, and connected me to this doctor, Dr. Schultz. And Dr. Schultz's position was that he was a grown man. He knew what was happening in Laos. He did nothing, absolutely nothing, within the scope of his profession or beyond it to make a stand for what he knew was happening. All of his life, he collected newspaper clippings and medical records of what was happening to the Hmong, pictures that he'd taken. He said that one day he was going to die having done nothing, and he wanted me to have it. He wanted me to do something with them. And so after my graduation, I came back. One day, there was this big box at my door, and it was all of these artifacts, all of these pictures. And then I learned about this thing called the object movie, how you can use pictures and move them and allow them to take shape again. It was similar to what I was doing on the page already, turning moments into memories, right? And so I collaborated with a filmmaker called John O'Brien to do that first one. You know, afterward, Minnesota Department of Health kept coming because they needed a writer. I don't know if you all know, but the biggest case of MDR-TB, this is like drug-resistant TB, happening in the world right now, is happening right here in the Twin Cities. Before the pandemic, this was the big concern. It's happening right here in Hmong and Karen refugees. And so they needed a filmmaker and a writer to be able to do that work of speaking to the community, but also keeping things kind of hush. That was going to be the book that I was going to write before the pandemic. So the film work continued. And I want to say this. Yesterday, I just finished a libretto for the Minnesota Opera. I am transliterating, adapting the song poet into a main stage production for the Minnesota Opera. Did I ever think I was going to be a librettist, let alone a filmmaker and everything else? No, I'm a kid who's never been to the opera, people. When I was at Columbia, you know, we found out about $5 tickets, so we went a few times. And yet, this is the truth. Given the opportunity, we rise to the challenge. For kids like me, those opportunities hardly ever come, so you never see yourself as that possibility. But given the opportunity to learn and grow, we rise to the moment. And so I've now become a librettist. And the Kansas Opera House now wants to hire me too. It's kind of incredible how these journeys go. But the thing I will say, and I think this is so important to say, is, you know, Deb is here and she's faculty. She's been here for a long time. I am not the kind of person to say no to opportunities for growth. I'm not the kind of person to leave anyone behind. And which is to say this, I travel, my ship is heavy. It is a large, large vessel that I sail into the ocean with. And to make sure that everybody's clothed, to make sure that everybody is fed, you gotta do what you need to do to be the kind of person that they dreamt you could be. Because at home, 30 minutes from here, there's a man and a woman. And when I get back into the car, they're gonna call me and they're gonna say, how did you do? How was your return to Carleton? Again, for my mom and my dad, I'm doing the thing they didn't dare dream of. They couldn't envision. And I want to tell them all of the good things, always all of the good things. And so I do, which is to say I make a lot of mistakes, which is to say I have to learn, I have to fumble, and I have to fall. But more than anything, I ask questions of the world. I ask questions of the world around me. And so, yeah, this is how I am becoming. Which is to say, maybe in 10 years again, Carleton might have me back. Maybe by then I'll have done some other new things that are pretty cool. But life is big. Do not limit yourself to one title or one position. Be everything that you want to be, in every single moment of where you are. That is it.
Did you have time for one more question? Okay.
Please. I'm good.
Wonderful. Thank you for these gifts you've really brought us. I want to give you a little gift too, which is a proverb from my home, my country, Mali, which in fact I shared with my students today, because we are reading a novel called The Belly of the Atlantic. In French, it's called Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, by a writer named Fatou Diom. She's a lady who lives in France. Anyway, so we're discussing, it's about immigration, the position of an immigrant who is supposed to be living in a rich country and all the expectations placed upon him or her by the community that he or she left. So I told them, I say, back home there is a proverb that says, exile knows no dignity, but it knows a child that is well brought up. I don't know if you can all understand what that means. Exile knows no dignity. Once you leave your country, forced to leave or because you want to seek fortune and fame and so forth, it's not written on your forehead the prestige you had. Are you the son of are you a prince? It's not written on your forehead. So your prestige doesn't matter there. But if you, as an individual, if you have internalized the good values that your society has given you, your parents have given you, you take that with you, exile will know that you are a worthy person to be respected. So I remember when I left my home when I was 19 to go overseas. I've been going ever since. My father, who had never been to school, but had learned to read and write in the French army as a soldier in the colonial soldier. He told me, wherever you go, son, you find yourself a father and a mother. Wherever you go. Because we won't be with you everywhere. If you fail to find yourself a father and a mother, don't blame anybody. You ask yourself the question, have I lived up to the values and the teachings we have given you? So this is the little gift I wanted to give you.
Thank you. I
Thank
would
you.
cherish those words.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is also another reason why I come back. I continue to learn every time I come here. No more questions? You all are going to have to go tell your peers what they missed out on, okay? You can tell everybody I'm at least 5, 6 people. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.